How did the US end up with over $32 trillion of debt? That is over 15 times more than the entire GDP of Russia, or 10 times the GDP of the United Kingdom. It doesn't matter how you look at this number, it's gigantic. But just 20 years ago, it was just $10 trillion. Still an enormous amount of money, but just a fraction or a third of today's national debt. The US debt has been accumulating for the last 245 years, but it has never been a problem. In fact, just 40 years ago, back in 1981, the US national debt was just a little over $3 trillion. From 1949 to 1981, the national debt remained at $3 trillion. The only significant jump was in 1940s when the US was dragged into World War II. World War II was the reason why the United States emerged as the global superpower and the US dollar became the global currency reserve. It's difficult to imagine, but the US dollar back then was tied to gold, which forced the United States to manage the dollar very responsibly, since other countries could come to the United States and exchange their dollars for gold. The gold standard heavily restricted the US budget, so getting rid of the gold standard gave the United States the freedom to print as many dollars as it wanted.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets.
But why did the rest of the world agree to accept the US dollar that isn't backed by gold? We won't get into the details since that's not the question of this video, but in short, the rest of the world didn't have a choice. Europe was still recovering from the World War II, China barely fed its population, the Soviet Union was on the brink of collapse, and the US was the most powerful economy with the most powerful military in the world. Accepting the US dollar meant access to the US technology and the world's largest economy. So what exactly happened in the 1980s that the federal debt began rising so fast? This guy became the president of the United States. He slashed taxes and increased military spending. That forced the government to borrow more to sustain such a huge spending when tax revenues were falling. So in just 20 years, the US national debt tripled to over $10 trillion. While it seems scary, the US got hooked. Especially when the Soviet Union collapsed, the US found itself as the only country that could guarantee global peace and started solving its problem by borrowing money. It might sound like I'm exaggerating, but just look at the numbers. Do you see the spike in 2001? When the dot-com bubble burst, the US found itself on the brink of a recession, so it just borrowed its way out of the crisis. Then came the invasion of Iraq, which also pushed the government to borrow massively to cover the astronomical cost of the war. All of that massive borrowing and loose regulations led to a housing bubble that eventually crushed the US economy.
Dow at the same time has fallen about 18%. The stock market is now down 21%.
Ideally, the US had to go through the same crisis as Greece did, imposing austerity measures and cut government spending. But the United States is not Greece, so it borrowed its way out of the crisis. In just 4 years, the national debt rose by $7 trillion, crossing the $20 trillion benchmark. But why wouldn't the US start paying off its debt? Well, the answer is complicated. The short answer is the US will never pay off its debts. It has already crossed the point of no return. It's no longer 1945 when the entire world is ruined by a war. Keeping the US supremacy is the first priority of the US foreign policy. The US is no longer just spending money on its military to simply safeguard its ships, but is preparing for a hypothetical war against China. And as China's economy grows, China spends more on its military. So the US will have to outspend China and be at the top of the world while keeping Russia in check. That's why when the pandemic hit, the US yet again just solved its problem by borrowing money to remain at the top of the world. But who exactly is the US borrowing so much money from? The short answer is everyone. And I really mean it, everyone. Around $7 trillion is held by other major US government entities such as the Social Security Trust Fund. The rest of it is owed to the public, including the Fed. The government owes the Fed at least $12 trillion. What happens if the government doesn't pay the Fed? Well, nothing, because the Fed is just part of the government. Another $7 trillion is owed to foreign countries such as Japan and China. The rest of it is owed by US companies, individuals, mutual funds, companies, and so on. This is both a weakness and a strength. Since everyone holds US bonds, which means that everyone is an investor in the US economy, everyone is interested in the prosperity and the stability of the United States, especially China. Because besides just being an investor, China holds trillions of the US dollars in its reserves. So what happens if the US won't be able to pay off its debts? Or to be more accurate, when it will not be able to pay off its debts? The outcome will be catastrophic both for the United States and the world, to say the least. First of all, it will quickly push the US into a recession that could easily turn into a depression, potentially lasting as long as the Great Depression, if not longer. One of the main reasons why the United States can borrow so much money at such a low rate in the first place is that because it's seen by investors as a safe investment. If a country like Argentina, for example, wants to borrow money, investors will require a much higher interest due to the country's history of defaulting on its debts. So defaulting on its loans would mean that the US will no longer be able to borrow money at such a low rate of 2 to 3%, which means it can't borrow as much money as it currently does. Secondly, the US pays around $400 billion just to cover the interest on its $30 trillion debt. How much interest do you pay on your credit card debt? In 2022, the US government spent $6.3 trillion, while it only earned $4.9 trillion, running a deficit of almost $1.4 trillion. Without borrowing money, it won't be able to sustain such a spending. If the US government stops making interest payments, for example, bondholders will immediately sell their bonds, causing a massive supply of bonds in the market with very little demand, ultimately crushing bond prices to rock bottom. This could spread doubt about the stability of the US dollar, which might push countries to rapidly get rid of the US dollar. The US government doesn't have enough foreign reserves to buy all of these dollars to maintain the value of the dollar, which means the value of the dollar could plummet instantly, causing hyperinflation in the country. That will send a shockwave to the economy. The panic will push investors to massively sell their stocks, causing the market to crash. Foreign investors will pull out their investments, causing the rest of the market to plummet. The US will struggle to pay its bills. That will push the US to cut its biggest spending, which is the military, which can lead to a catastrophic change in the global world order that will no longer serve the US interest. But how likely the US will default on its debts? Think of the United States as a rich billionaire who doesn't have a lot of cash. Elon Musk is worth $227 billion. But if you ask him to come up with $50 billion in cash, he can't, because most of his money is tied to Tesla and SpaceX. The only way for him to raise that much money is by massively selling Tesla shares, which will drive the stock price down and dwindle his net worth. So here's how billionaires actually make money. If Elon Musk needs $45 billion to buy a social media company, for example, he would just go and borrow that money from financial institutions. Because he's so rich and less likely to default, banks will charge him a very low interest rate. As long as Musk can make the minimum payment to serve his loan, he can keep borrowing money. That's why billionaires, regardless of how much money they make, still borrow money to buy houses, mansions, and even yachts, especially when that money is tax-free. If you borrow $100 million at 2% interest rate while you can make a 10% return on that money, you're essentially left with an extra $8 million. You should be borrowing as much as you can. So as long as the US economy is growing and the cost of borrowing is so low, there is no reason not to borrow to keep the US dollar the global currency reserve. That's why the United States government has raised the debt ceiling like over 100 times. However, the global economy is changing, especially after the West imposed massive sanctions on Russia. That led many countries to take serious actions to move away from the US dollar. That will not happen overnight, but that will definitely push the United States to borrow more to be able to stay at the top of the game for as long as possible, which will speed up the process of the de-dollarization of the world. And that's when the biggest crash in history of the United States will happen. If you have enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Thanks guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.